from our work, we kind of noticed the business cycle structure. We're both business cycle analysts. We've both been looking at them for a long time. It changed after 2008, and it became like a metronome every 4 years. That's only happened once in the past, which was the 1950s and 60s, where it became very, very cyclical. But this is perfectly cyclical. And it got me thinking for a while, what the hell? So many of us didn't understand what happened to asset prices after 2008. We kind of knew quantitative easing was happening. We kind of knew stuff, but we didn't figure it out. And what I suddenly realized is that in 2008, we had a debt jubilee. And in fact, it was just forgiveness on interest. You don't pay interest payments. Remember, we did that over COVID. Exactly same mechanism, no interest payments. So no interest payments allowed every government who had basically, they'd all gone over 100% of GDP in debt. So all economic activity, all economic growth was used to paying of debts. So what they all did was basically restructure their debts between 3 and 5 years, creating an almost perfect 4-year cycle. And then when you look at the debts today, we're in that 4th year now where the final part, the larger part of the debt is due. And what we found is they start injecting liquidity over a period of 3 years, reaching maximum liquidity. That liquidity injection never really gets taken back. Some gets taken back in the bear market years when they're withdrawing liquidity, raising interest rates, trying to slow the economic cycle because of inflation or whatever. But over time, liquidity keeps rising. It's rising at a rate of about 8% a year. And that is, in fact, the debasement rate of fiat currency. And what happens is, and this is the bit that gets contentious with people and they hate it, if you divide an asset by the global liquidity, you get to see whether it's outperformed. The debasement,
people hate that chart.
Oh, they hate it. But it is the best chart in the world because it then tells you, okay, if I'm to allocate to the S&P 500, I'm basically breaking even versus debasement. So the S&P 500 is not really adding much value. Well, when you look at the Euro stocks and other markets, which are priced in their local currencies, you put them in dollars, they look similar. All the markets look very similar once you adjust for debasement. So that was interesting to me. Gold, complete almost flat line, really, versus debasement, as it should be, right? That's gold's job. It's to be the stable currency. And once we looked at the world through this lens of the debasement of fiat currency, which again is still contentious, becoming less so nowadays, but it was really contentious when we started it, we realized there's actually only 2 assets that outperform this. One is tech stocks and the other is crypto. And so that completely changed how I allocated and how I understood tech stocks. I was a macro guy. I hated tech stocks. They're always too expensive. You're always a value guy. And I realized none of that made sense in this market. That's why the value investors have been getting killed, is what had happened was all of this. Now, what is driving this? And I think, Julian, if you can just bring up those demographic charts, because these are the absolute most important charts in the world, really, to understand. GDP growth is driven by this magic formula, which is debt growth plus population growth plus productivity growth. That's how you drive trend rate of GDP. Now, debt growth's gone to extremists, and now really we're just servicing debts. Basically, GDP keeps falling, and it's falling over time, the trend rate of GDP, because of the magic formula. And Julian, if you can get to the demographics charts, because they're the key ones here. The issue is here, the biggest secular factor in all of markets is this one thing, is the aging of population. And we can see the births rate is falling in the US, much faster elsewhere. So that obviously is a function, the labor force participation rate, the size of the workforce, is a function of births, deaths, or the number of people being born, whatever, right? And you hear the phrase demographics are destiny. They are, until the AI and the robots come, which are basically artificial humans. This is the problem that faces us all. But there's a way that they've got around this. If you go to the next chart, is they've increased government debt to offset the declining growth from the population. So part of the magic formula was the debt growth and the other was the population growth. So they've used debt growth. This chart nobody understands and it's never been copied on X, which is the bizarrest thing because it's the most incredible chart of all, which basically says that all government debt growth is basically a function of labour force participation rate. Now, what's interesting is then, okay, so the debts keep going up. We know the forward look of where the labour force participation rate is going to go, and how it's being funded is liquidity. And this is Fed net liquidity. You're probably better to use US total liquidity because that includes the private sector because they're now using the banking sector. So what they're doing basically is debasing currency to pay for the debt. It's as old as the hills. It's as old as the story of economies. It's as old as the story of money. And it's happening at a very pernicious rate of 8%. So you kind of notice it, but don't notice it. But what's happening is asset prices keep going up optically because the currency is getting debased. Even if you look at real estate adjusted by the debasement by liquidity, it's basically a flat line. But wages are a variable input. And so what you find is that wages do not account for this. It's also the same factor that is driving PE ratios that drives everybody nuts. Why are PE ratios going up over time? Because the P goes up because of debasement. The E is a variable and doesn't. So it always goes up in line with debasement. And we've shown that over time too. So this is the really big picture of what we look at. It allowed us to understand there's only two assets to own. And then we got to a further realization, which is, okay, if 97% of all of NASDAQ's price action is driven by debasement. It's the strongest factor we've ever had in any macro regime in history. Okay, great. That makes macro super easy. For crypto, it's 90%. So we've basically got a factor that's so powerful that nothing else matters. Brilliant. So then let's take the NASDAQ. If we've got one force, one economic force, we take the NASDAQ, we divide it by by Bitcoin, it's down 99.97%. So you kind of get one asset allocation only, which is crypto, which is bizarre. In a macro world, we now think you need concentrated portfolios as opposed to diverse portfolios. In fact, diversification just destroys returns now because you've got one clear macro factor. So that's really what we're doing. And then we spend a huge amount of time working on the business cycle and the various components of all of this, how it comes together and where we are in timing of that.
And just to reinforce some of what Raoul was said, Felix, if you want to pull up this chart on the NASDAQ, I mean, this is including dividends. So this is total return in excess of, our GMI, total liquidity composite. And you can see that it annualizes around 13% in excess of the real rate of debasement. So that's the point, is that 8% is the hidden loss of value from central banks essentially debasing their currencies, which weakens the currency in all financial contexts. And then the visible rise of, let's say prices at the supermarket is, as we know, inflation, right? So you have to kind of bolt that on. That can be 2-3%. But the point is that in real terms, the NASDAQ's making money. In real terms, Bitcoin, if we look back to, 2010 or so, is annualizing around 150%. But if we compare it more recently with the NASDAQ, it's around 95%. So that upper white box you can see in the left-hand corner. But then, as Raoul said, if you look at the NASDAQ in total return terms versus Bitcoin, again, since January of 2012, when we're based to 100, it's down 99.94%. And so to the point that Raoul said, in real terms, nothing, if you look at the red box, these are the annualized numbers since 2011 or so. But essentially, nothing's accumulating purchasing power outside of, let's say, US large cap, NASDAQ and ETH, but that's in real terms. In nominal terms, even US large cap equities like the S&P 500 are not compounding purchasing power. It's literally just tech and crypto, and tech's down 99.94%. And then there's also this gold thing I think is really interesting, because Raoul's right. Gold's done its job, but then you have this whole basket of people who are, quote unquote, gold bugs. And the really interesting thing about gold, and it's had a great year this year, but if you look at the annualized return going all the way back to whatever it is, 1950s, 1960s, is gold has made you richer, or sorry, it's made you money, but it hasn't made you richer. You see what I mean? So it's like a nominal illusion because you've actually made money, but if you adjust for the rate at which central banks are debasing their currency, you're actually losing purchasing power. So that's the point, is like cash, gold, everything outside of crypto and tech, you're actually losing purchasing power over time. And that's a dangerous game, especially since 2008.
And once we discovered all of this stuff, the hard pivot I took to completely focus on it, we never look at them, but never have trade recommendations in emerging markets, FX, anything anymore. And I used to do all of it. I'm like, it's irrelevant if 97.5% of all of it is driven by one factor.